It was terrifying. Awakening the town of St. Mary Me lay serene under a cloud of autumn mist, with its cobbled alleys and charming cottages. Untouched by the turbulence of the wider world on such a calm night, Reverend Henry Langley was abruptly woken by an unnerving commotion. The grandfather clock in his bedroom ticked with an unusual persistence, each chime echoing ominously through the silent house. Reverend Langley, a man of routine and gentle disposition, felt an inexplicable thirst that nudged him from his slumber. He slipped out of bed, wrapped himself in a soft dressing gown, and padded quietly down the hallway. The house was cloaked in shadows. Reverend Langley's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to comprehend the attack. The scent of damp leaves and wood smoke wafted through the air, a comforting reminder of the village's peaceful existence. But as he reached for a glass from the cupboard, a sudden sharp pain seared through his side, startled him. He recoiled only to find a glint of metal catching the moonlight, a knife. The blade pressed against his flesh with startling precision. Reverend Langley, despite his surprise, managed to grasp the assailant's wrist, feeling the cold grip of fear and resolve. The encounter was swift and silent, a ballet of shadows and anguish in the dark of night. Finally, the attacker retreated, leaving Reverend Langley bruised but amazingly alive. Breathing deeply, he leaned against the kitchen counter, feeling the weight of the night's events press down on him who would seek to harm a humble clergyman such as himself. The motive was unclear, but the attempt was deliberate and calculated. Reverend Langley knew that such an act could not be dismissed as a mere burglary gone wrong or a random act of violence the following morning. Reverend Langley sat in his study, the early sunshine seeping through the lace curtains, casting lovely patterns on the oak desk packed with sermons and parish records. He considered the night's events, his mind racing through possibilities. The attack had seemed personal, too precise to be the work of a stranger. He considered the dynamics of his household, his wife Elena, their daughter Margaret, his brother Edward James, the servant, and Mrs. Jane, the caretaker for his elderly mother, each holding a key to his life and perhaps unknowingly to a motive for malice. Reverend Langley had always prided himself on preserving harmonious relationships, but he suddenly suspected that secrets were lying beneath the surface. Determined to unearth the truth, he realized he needed assistance, beyond his limited means. The thought of searching out Miss Marple came to him. Known in St. Mary Mead for her extraordinary ability for solving mysteries that confused even the most astute, Miss Marple was a trusted confidant for many in the village. Her reputation for sharp observation, psychological insight, and a touch of subtle humor made her the perfect candidate to unravel the tangled web surrounding his attempted murder. With a resolute heart, Reverend Langley penned a letter to Miss Marple, detailing the unsettling events of that fateful night and requesting her assistance. He enclosed a modest sum to cover her expenses, hoping she would accept his plea, for Miss Marple was already on her way, prepared to illuminate the darkness with her amazing insight. Chapter 2. Collecting the suspects, Miss Marple arrived at the Langley property on a crisp Monday morning, the sun casting a warm glow over the well-tended gardens of the old house. The stately facade, with its ivy-clad walls and decorative shutters, projected an air of timeless elegance as she approached. The robust oak door, Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and rang the bell, her presence as inconspicuous as usual. Elena Langley met her at the door, her posture composed and graceful. Elena, a woman in her early 50s, exhibited a serene beauty. Her silver hair was perfectly pinned back, and her eyes reflected quiet strength. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming," she said with a gentle smile, stepping aside to allow her guest entry inside the house, which was a harmonious blend of classic charm and modern comfort. The spacious drawing room, adorned with family portraits and antique furnishings, served as the perfect setting for Miss Marple's inquiries. Eleanor introduced her to the other members of the household immediately after she settled there, the first being Margaret Langley. The minister's daughter is a lively young woman. In her mid-20s, her lively spirit was visible in her expressive motions and bright eyes. But Miss Marple sensed a subtle shadow of sorrow lingering beneath her happy facade. Margaret greeted Miss Marple with a warm hug. Her smile filled the room, yet there was an underlying melancholy that intrigued Miss Marple's curiosity. Next came Edward Langley, Reverend Langley's younger brother. Tall and impeccably dressed, Edward exuded an air of authority and ambition. His firm handshake and reserved demeanor suggested a man accustomed to leadership. But Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of tension beneath his composed facade. James, the Langley household's long-serving servant, was in his late 40s. James was the pinnacle of discretion and reliability. His quiet presence and precise attitude spoke of years spent ensuring that the household ran well. Miss Marple highlighted his keen attention to detail and the polite distance he kept, a feature that often hid deeper insights. Finally, Mrs. Jane was presented. She acted as the caretaker for Reverend Langley's elderly mother, a woman of senior age. Mrs. Jane moved with quiet efficiency. Her mild approach was a comforting presence in the household. Her interactions were respectful but measured, revealing little about her own thoughts or feelings. Miss Marple started her inquiry with subtle observations and pleasant discussions, aware that each individual carries their own secrets. Elena spoke softly about the domestic routines, her gaze periodically darting away as if guarding buried feelings. Margaret was lively, but there was a tinge of grief underneath her happy appearance. Edward kept a guarded stance, his ambition barely hidden beneath his respectful demeanor. Miss Marple was intrigued by James' meticulous attention to detail, even though he was a man of few words. Finally, Mrs. Hargreaves moved with quiet efficiency, her presence almost ghost-like as she attended to the needs of Reverend Langley's mother. As Miss Marple interacted with each suspect, she took note of their unease and the subtle clues that might point to their involvement in the attempted attack. Elena acknowledged feeling apprehensive after the incident. Margaret was distracted yet cooperative. Edward offered a good alibi for the night in issue. James appeared devoted but secretive. Mrs. Harries kept a controlled facade, providing little beyond basic pleasantries. It was evident that beneath the facade of this respectable household lied a web of motivations and possibilities, each of which held a piece of the jigsaw that Miss Marple was resolved to unravel with her quick observation and inherent grasp of human nature. As the day faded to dusk, Miss Marple began untangling the intricate ties and secret resentments that could have contributed to Reverend Langley's attempted murder. Miss Marple retired to her temporary guest room, her mind buzzing with the day's findings. She knew that the answers lay in the subtle nuances of behavior and the unspoken tensions that threaded through the Langley family. With a keen eye and a patient heart, Miss Marple was ready to delve deeper into the mystery, confident that the truth would soon reveal itself. Chapter 3. Elena's Tangled Secrets. Miss Marple decided to delve deeper into Elena Langley's life, believing that the minister's wife held crucial pieces of the puzzle. With a gentle knock, she requested another audience with Elena, who welcomed her into the serene sunroom adorned with blooming geraniums and soft pastel drapes. "Elena, I appreciate your honesty so far," may I ask you a couple more questions regarding your connection with Reverend Langley? Miss Marple's speech was as pleasant as the afternoon light flowing through windows. Elena nodded, her expression thoughtful. Miss Marple, what do you want to know? Miss Marple leaned forward with her knitting temporarily left aside. You mentioned earlier that your sister and Reverend Langley were formerly pretty close. Could you tell me more about that? Eleanor sighed, her eyes clouded with a mix of nostalgia and sadness. Yes, my sister Victoria and Henry had a strong bond in their younger years. They spent countless hours discussing everything from theology to literature. Some villagers suspected about an affair, but Henry consistently dismissed such stories as unfounded. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with curiosity. Did Victoria ever speak about Henry in a way that implied more than familial affection? Elena paused, then continued gently. Victoria was always the more vivacious of us. She had a charm that drew people in, including Henry. While there was certainly a deep affection, I believe it was platonic, however. Such intense friendships often fuel misunderstandings. Miss Marple nodded attentively. How did you feel about their relationship? Elena's gaze met Miss Mare's, revealing a flicker of vulnerability. Initially, I was supportive. Henry and I have always been partners in marriage and ministry, but as time passed, I felt an emotional distance growing between us. Perhaps it was the burden of his duties or my personal preoccupations. Miss Marple smiled reassuringly. It's natural for relationships to change, but has this distance ever led to substantial arguments or conflicts? Elena paused to reflect. There were conflicts. Yes, Henry got more engrossed in his work, frequently late into the night. I occasionally felt neglected, but I loved him sincerely and never wished him harm. Miss Marple observed Elena's composed demeanor, noting the subtle tremor in her hands as she reached for her teacup. Have you noticed any changes in Henry's behavior recently? Anything unusual that might shed light on the attack? Elena frowned slightly now that you mention it. Henry had been more secretive lately, working late in his study and rarely sharing details of his activities. I figured it was tied to parish issues, but possibly there is more to it. Miss Marple taps her chin thoughtfully. Secrecy can frequently be a cloak concealing hidden problems. Did Henry ever tell you about any specific worries or threats? Elena shook her head. He was always a man of prudence, and if there were conflicts, he addressed them quietly. I can't think of anyone who would wish him harm, except those who disliked his profession or personal life. Miss Marple's mind raced over the possibilities, piecing together Elena's insights and her own observations. Thank you, Elena. Your candor is quite useful. One last thing, have you noticed anyone behaving abnormally around the house or displaying undue interest in Henry's affairs? Elena paused for a second. Indeed, Mrs. Hargreaves has been acting slightly distant lately. She used to be more forthcoming, but recently she seems focused, almost secretive. But I couldn't exactly place why. Miss Marple's eyes shone with fresh excitement. Thank you, Elena, for providing crucial information. I feel this will much aid in understanding the truth behind Reverend Langley's attack. As Elena rose leaves, Miss Marple couldn't help but admire her resilience. The minister's wife, once a pillar of grace, now exhibited layers of complexity that hinted at underlying conflicts between Elena's revelations concerning Victoria's relationship and Henry's increasing opacity. The web of motives thickened, leading Miss Marple closer to the center of the mystery. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her guest room, poring over her notes. Elena's insight indicated that personal grievances and hidden emotions played a key role in the attempted attack. The remark of Mrs. Harry's strange behavior added another thread to the complicated tapestry of suspects as the shadows extended outside her window. Miss Marple felt the pieces beginning to align, each clue bringing her closer to deciphering the truth behind Reverend Langley's nocturnal visitor chapter. For Margaret has a bitter heart. The early sun poured through the lace curtains as Miss Marple prepared for her next interview. After gaining substantial insights from Elena Langley, she now shifted her attention to Margaret. The minister's daughter, Margaret's vivacious disposition and the subtle melancholy beneath her bright appearance had piqued Miss Marple's curiosity, hinting that there might be more to her than greeted the eye. Miss Marple discovered Margaret in the drawing room, seated by the window with a book in hand. Her auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her bright eyes gleamed with a mix of warmth and underlying tension as Miss Marple entered. Margaret looked up and gave a lovely grin. "Good morning, Miss Marple. It's nice to see you again." Margaret regarded her voice as pleasant and welcoming. "Good morning, Margaret. May I join you?" Miss Marple asked, settling into a comfortable chair opposite. "Her, of course," Margaret replied, setting her book aside. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting at all. I wanted to speak with you about the night Reverend Langley was attacked." Miss Marple began gently. Margaret's expression shifted slightly as a shadow crossing her features. "Yes, that was a frightening night. I was at a party with friends celebrating the harvest festival, and other villagers can attest to my presence there." Miss Marple nodded and made a mental note to verify. "The alibi tells me, Margaret. How have you been feeling after the attack?" Margaret sighed, her eyes briefly far away. "It has been difficult. Father has always been a pillar of strength, but this occurrence has rocked him severely, and of course it is affecting all of us." Miss Marple moved closer, her tone encouraging. "I understand that such an incident might elicit a variety of feelings. I would like to ask you about something from your past that may be significant to our research." Margaret's interest was piqued. "Anything, Miss Marple. I want to help in any way I can," taking a big breath. Miss Marple continued, "I understand that your father was involved in the unfortunate death of your former lover, James Whittaker. Could you tell me more about that?" Margaret's face paled slightly, and she looked away, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of hair. "James and I were inseparable in our youth. We dreamed of a future together, but circumstances tore us apart, Father. He believed James was leading me astray, and in his frustration he confronted him. It was a heated argument, beyond anyone's control," Miss Marple observed. Margaret carefully noted the true anguish in her eyes. "That must have been a horrific experience for you. How has that influenced your relationship with your father since then?" Margaret paused a time before responding, which put a space between us. "I love my father very much, but I've always felt that he didn't understand me. The loss of James left a void that I've struggled to fill." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Such deep-seated emotions can often influence our actions in ways we might not immediately recognize. Have you ever felt resentment towards your father because of what happened with James?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There were times when I felt angry and abandoned, but I've tried to focus on healing and building my own life." Miss Marple provided a reassuring grin. "I commend your strength, Margaret. It's crucial to recognize and treat our feelings. One final question. Can you conceive of someone who would have a grudge against your father or have a cause to wish him harm?" Margaret shook her head. "Not that I can think of. Our family is well regarded in the community, and father has always been dedicated to his parish work. If anyone had a reason to target him, I'm not aware of it." Miss Marple thanked Margaret for her openness. She left the drawing room with a heavy heart, contemplating the layers of grief and resentment that lay beneath Margaret's bright exterior. The connection between the past and the present was undeniable, implying that the shadows of old wounds could still cast long and dark lines over the present. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her guest room reflecting on her findings. Margaret's history with James Whittaker added a compelling dimension to the case, presenting a possible motive rooted in personal loss and unresolved emotions. However, Margaret's alibi appeared solid, supported by multiple witnesses. The detective knew that understanding the intricate web of relationships and past grievances was essential to uncovering the truth behind Reverend Langley's attempted murder. Miss Marple vowed to probe deeper into Margaret's past, finding links that might reveal hidden reasons. The riddle was growing increasingly complicated, but Miss Marr's steadfast drive told her that the answers were within reach. Chapter 5. Edward's ambitious veins. The next day dawned bright and clear, putting an optimistic light over St. Mary Me. Miss Marple, undeterred by the previous day's revelations, set her sights on Edward Langley, Rev. Langley's younger brother. Edward's calm manner and obvious ambition made him a figure of interest in the growing mystery. Miss Marple discovered Edward in his study, a space crammed with shelves of perfectly ordered books and papers. He looked up from his desk, fixing his glasses with a studied grace, is tall and impeccably dressed. "Good morning," Edward emanated, an air of power that Miss Marple found both intriguing and slightly terrifying. Miss Marple greeted him cheerfully, taking a seat opposite him. "Good morning, Miss Marple. What do I owe the pleasure?" Edward replied with a pleasant but restrained tone. "I'd want to ask you a few questions regarding the night Reverend Langley was attacked." Miss Marple began, her gaze warm but inquisitive. Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Of course, I'm still shaken by the incident. Reverend Henry is like a brother to me." Miss Marple nodded, noting the subtle tightness around his jaw. "I understand you were out on a business trip that night. Could you tell me more about that?" Edward sighed slightly, rubbing his temples before adding, "Yes, I was in London attending a conference on church administration. Several colleagues can confirm my presence there. It was an important meeting that I couldn't afford to miss." Miss Marple made a mental note to confirm his alibi with the conference organizers. "I understand your absence surely provides a strong alibi, but I'm intrigued about your relationship with Reverend Langley. It's clear you both share a profound bond, but I've also heard whispers of ambition on your part." Edward's eyes narrowed slightly, indicating a spark of defensiveness. Crossing his characteristics ambition, I like my brother immensely and have always supported his work. In fact, I've contemplated taking on extra responsibility to aid the church. Thrive, Miss Marple smiled gently. Ambition may be a two-edged sword. Edward, it is crucial to combine personal ambitions with familial harmony. Have you ever had conflicts with Reverend Langley about the direction of the parish or other matters? Edward pondered for a time before responding. There have been professional discussions, and while it is natural for siblings to have different points of view, nothing that would lead to ill feelings or confrontation. Miss Marple leans forward, her gaze steady. I realize how vital it is to preserve good connections, especially within the family, but, given your desire, did you ever feel like Reverend Langley was holding you back or overshadowing your contributions? Edward hesitated, his expression guarded. I've always appreciated his position and his experience if I ever felt overshadowed. I opted to handle it via productive discourse rather than resentment. Miss Marple nodded, accepting his explanation. but seeing the little strain in his stance. "Thank you, Edward. Your cooperation is really appreciated. One more question. Do you have any clue into who would have desired harm on Reverend Langley?" Edward shook his head. He couldn't conceive of someone with such motives. "Reverend Henry is beloved by the community, and I'm confident no one would wish to kill him." As their conversation finished, Miss Marple experienced a combination of relief and lingering suspicion. Edward's alibi appeared solid, supported by multiple sources, but his guarded responses hinted at deeper layers beneath his courteous exterior. His ambition, while not overly malicious, added a complex dimension to the investigation. Later that afternoon, Miss Morrell decided to pay a visit to the local church where Edward had been presenting, speaking with a few of his colleagues. She confirmed his attendance at the conference, solidifying his alibi. The whispers of his ambition echoed in her thoughts, suggesting that while Edward might not have had the opportunity to harm his brother, his goals may have influenced those around him. Returning to the Langley residence, Miss Marple reflected on her discoveries. Edward's desire, along with his imposing presence, formed a picture of a man eager for recognition and authority. While not directly implicated, his function within the family and church may cross with the motives of others as nighttime descended. Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, her thoughts weaving through the intricate relationships within the Langley household. Edward's ambition was a piece of the puzzle, but the true culprit remained elusive. With each interview, the mystery deepened, and Miss Marple's determination to uncover the truth only grew stronger. Chapter 6. James' hidden key. Miss Marple resolved to delve deeper into the life of James, the Langley household's long-serving servant. His quiet demeanor and meticulous nature had always suggested reliability, but recent revelations necessitated a closer examination. Equipped with her notebook and an air of gentle determination, she made her way to the servants' modest quarters. James greeted her with a courteous nod as she entered his neatly kept chamber. A man in his late 40s, James radiated an atmosphere of steadfastness. His wardrobe was basic, yet excellent, ably clean, reflecting his attention to his profession. "Good morning, Miss Marple. How can I help you today?" he asked, his voice steady and composed. "Good morning, James," Miss Marple responded enthusiastically. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me again. Of course, Miss Marple, Reverend Langley has always talked highly of you," he said, slipping into a chair opposite her. Miss Marple took a seat, her gaze friendly and inquiring. "I wanted to discuss your role in the home, especially with Reverend Langley's personal issues." James nodded attentively. "I handle many of the minister's personal concerns, including the preservation of his study and the security of his personal items." "Yes, I believe you possess a key to Reverend Langley's vault. Could you tell me more about that?" Miss Marple said, noticing his calm manner. James pondered for a bit before saying, "Yes, Miss Marple, Reverend Langley trusts me to keep the vault secure. Thus the key is always on my person when I perform my duties." Miss Marple made a mental note of his explanation. "Were you in possession of the key on the night of the attack?" James nodded. "Indeed. I was attending to some maintenance in the study, ensuring everything was in order. Reverend Langley frequently works late, and I make sure his environment is suitable to his job." Miss Marple studied him intently, looking for any hint of deceit. "Did you notice anything peculiar that evening, such as disruptions or unfamiliar visitors?" James shook his head. "Nothing out of the ordinary. The family was peaceful, as it always is. Late at night, I was in the study, and after my rounds, I retreated to my chambers. Your alibi is vital, James. Did anyone observe you during your rounds, or have any interaction with you that night? Miss Marple softly pressed. James studied the question. Not specifically. Most of the household was asleep, and Reverend Langley was. In his study, I was alone, as usual. Miss Marple nodded, accepting his statement, but observing the slight strain in his stance. Thank you, James. Your cooperation is greatly appreciated. As she rose to go, Miss Marple felt a mix of relief and lingering mistrust, because James had a credible alibi. The presence of the vault key remained a vital piece of the jigsaw. Access to the vault could imply knowledge of valuable objects or sensitive data that might provide a purpose for the attack. Determined to check his statements, Miss Marple decided to examine the vault herself later that afternoon. She led James to Reverend Langley's study, which was a blend of scholastic order and personal comfort, with shelves of books and meticulously ordered files. The vault, a solid metal door embedded in the wall, stood like a silent sentinel. James produced the key and unlocked the vault with practiced ease within. Miss Marple noted beautifully ordered materials, a few personal mementos, and numerous closed boxes. Is there anything of particular value here that might throw light on recent events? She queried. James looked around before responding. The documents are basically parish documents and personal communication. The secured boxes hold valuables and some personal items. Reverend Langley chose to remain secret. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the contents. Thank you, James. This knowledge is really helpful. As she left the study, Miss Marple pondered the importance of the key. While James had access to the vault, there was no clear evidence linking him directly to the attack, but the capacity to enter the vault surreptitiously still posed a possible risk, keeping him firmly within the field of suspicion. That evening, Miss Marple retired to her guest room, her thoughts turning over the day's results. James' involvement in the family was undoubtedly crucial, and his access to the vault gave a new dimension to the mystery, but without more evidence. His innocence or guilt remained ambiguous, with the inquiry proceeding gradually. Miss Marple was confident that each revelation brought her closer to uncovering the truth behind Reverend Langley's attempted murder. As the night deepened, she prepared for the next phase of her investigation, knowing that patience and keen observation would eventually reveal the hidden motives within the Langley household. Chapter 7. The caretaker's cloak. The morning sun gave a golden tint over St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple prepared to examine the mysterious Mrs. Jane. The babysitter for Reverend Lang's elderly mother had always seemed a figure of calm dedication. However, recent revelations hinted to layers behind her unassuming demeanor that deserved greater study. Miss Marple began her day with a visit to the local library, poring over any available data regarding Mrs. Hares. She discovered that Mrs. Hares had come in St. Mary Me only 2 years before, and her past was largely unknown. Intrigued by the lack of information, Miss Marple felt driven to investigate deeper, returning to the Langley residence. Miss Marple discovered Mrs. Jane tending to the garden, her actions precise and professional. The caregiver was a slim woman in her 60s, with nicely coiffed silver hair and modest yet impeccably clean apparel. "Good morning, Mrs. Jane," Miss Marple greeted warmly. "Good morning, Miss Marple. How may I assist you today?" she said with a cordial smile, yet her eyes retained a guarded attitude. Miss Marple relaxed onto a nearby bench and observed the caretaker's demeanor. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I have a few more questions about the events surrounding Reverend Langley's attack." Mrs. Hargreaves naturally inclined her head slightly. "Miss Marple, please ask away." Miss Marple began slowly. I've noticed some contradictions in your statements of recent actions. Could you tell me more about your work here and any peculiar happenings you've witnessed? Mrs. Jane sighed softly, her gaze momentarily distant. My primary duty is to care for Reverend Langley's mother, ensuring her comfort and well-being. As for unusual occurrences, there hasn't been much to report, and the household remains as peaceful as ever. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, sensing there was more to uncover. I understand, but I've come across some information that suggests you might have connections outside of our village. Is there anything you can share about your Miss Marple? I like to focus on my responsibilities here. Miss Marple smiled gently. Of course, I respect your privacy, but given the circumstances of Reverend Langley's attack, any information could be important before Mrs. Jane could respond. A knock echoed from the front door. It was James, the servant, bringing fresh tea for Miss Marple as he entered. Miss Marple observed his brief interaction with Mrs. Jane. There was a subtle tension, a silent exchange that did not go unnoticed after James left. Miss Marple decided to inspect the caretaker's quarters. She found a small locked drawer in Mrs. Hague. Reeves's writing desk. With her polite inquiry, Mrs. Hague reluctantly allowed her access inside. Miss Marple discovered a collection of foreign letters, neatly tied with a ribbon, and a few peculiar trinkets that did not belong to the Miss Marple confronted Mrs. Harries about her findings. These letters and artifacts suggest ties beyond what you've disclosed. Are you affiliated with any organizations or groups that may be interested in Reverend Langley? Mrs. Harris's composure broke for a moment before she said, I assure you, Miss Marcel, that my only concern is the welfare of Reverend Langley's mother in the smooth running of this household. Miss Marcel leaned closer, her eyes glittering with insight. Sometimes our roles demand us to wear different cloaks. Mrs. Hare's presence here, your dedication, speaks of loyalty, but these letters imply otherwise. Are you possibly a spy sent by a rival faction? The allegation hung in the air, thick with insinuation. Mrs. Hague Reeves' veneer eventually broke, revealing a tired resignation. Yes, Miss Marple, I was asked to monitor Reverend Langley, as some feel his influence could shift issues beyond our awareness. Miss Morell listened closely, absorbing the seriousness of the revelation. Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Jane. While your motives might not have been malicious, your being here complicates the situation. As Miss Marple left the Langley residence, she pondered the caretaker's confession. A spy in their midst added a new dimension to the mystery, intertwining personal motives with broader intrigues. However, the true attacker eluded her, and the shadow of suspicion loomed over each household member that evening. Miss Marple, Mrs. Reeves' role as a spy was a significant clue, but Miss Marple knew that the heart of the mystery lay in understanding the intricate web of relationships and hidden agendas within the Langley household. With renewed determination, she prepared for the final phase of her investigation, confident that the truth within reach. Chapter 8, The Revelation. The grand oak door of Reverend Henry Langley's office stood ajar as Miss Marple entered her presence, immediately commanding the attention of those gathered within. Margaret, Edward, James, and Mrs. Jane sat in a semicircle, their expressions a mix of expectation and unease. Reverend Langley himself stood at the head of the room, his posture calm and expectant. Miss Marple took a seat, her eyes methodically scanning each face before settling on the minister. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice steady and clear. After 3 weeks of careful investigation, I believe it is time to reveal the truth behind Reverend Langley's attempted attack. A collective murmur filled the room, tension heavy in the air. Reverend Langley leaned forward, interest visible in his gaze. "Miss Marple, how can you be so certain?" Miss Marple smiled gently, appreciating the minister's genuine interest. "Each of you had reasons that could have led to Reverend Langley's attack. But on closer examination, all alleys hold firm, leaving no room for doubt among the 5 of you." She began outlining her deductions. 1. Elena Langley. Elena was aware of her husband's former romance with her sister, Victoria. This knowledge may engender animosity, but Eleanor's habit of taking sleeping pills made it improbable she was awake and capable of the attack that occurred during the night too. Margaret Langley. Margaret harbored deep-seated anguish about her father's role in her previous lover, James Whittaker's death, while this gave a purpose. Her alibi of attending a harvest party was confirmed by other villagers, making her presence elsewhere indisputable. 3. Edward Langley. Edward's goal to accede to his brother's status gave him a plausible reason. Nevertheless, his alibi of being away on a business trip was validated by conference participants, clearing him of suspicion. 4th, James, possessing the key to Reverend Langley's vault, suggested potential access to valuables or sensitive documents. But James was accounted for having been with Mrs. Hargreaves in their quarters throughout the night. Indem, Mrs. Hargreaves, while her role as a spy introduced an element of intrigue. Her alibi, supported by James' testimony, firmly placed her away. From the scene of the attack, Miss Marple paused, allowing the weight of her analysis to sink. The audience fell silent, each member wrestling with their own reflections on the findings. Reverend Langley's gaze met Miss Marple with a glimmer of recognition. Dawning upon him, Miss Marple, who could it possibly be, with a serene smile. Miss Marple leaned slightly closer. "The solution, Reverend, lays right before us. You orchestrated the attack yourself." Gasps and astonished whispers erupted from the audience as all eyes turned to the minister. Reverend Langley remained composed, a mixture of relief and amusement flickering across his features. "Miss Marple, we attended the same school when we were children, and I respected your investigative aspirations even then. I wanted to test your skills and see whether you could unravel a mystery as intricate as any you would encounter." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully at the excellent trick. "The lack of a genuine struggle in the discovery of the knife in your garb, where you frequently paint, were the primary evidence of the planned attack." Reverend Langley grinned quietly. "You're truly outstanding in your craft, Miss Marple, and it appears your reputation is well deserved." Miss Marple provided a pleasant grin, her eyes glittering with joy. "Thank you, Reverend. It was an unusual case, and I'm pleased to have been of aid." As the tension in the room broke into relieved laughing, Miss Marple graciously took her departure. Reverend Langley brought her to the door and extended his hand pleasantly. "Your skills are outstanding, Miss Marple. I look forward to future cooperation." With a final nod, Miss Marple went outdoors into the cool evening air, the enigma gracefully resolved. As she made her way home, she couldn't help but giggle quietly to herself. Even the most complicated puzzles could be unraveled with patience, sharp insight, and a hint of sly comedy.